Just like in any industry, manga authors can find it hard to move away from their genre of choice. Whether it be because of their art style, the types of stories they want to tell, or simply whichever they think is cooler, when you find what works, it can be very hard to branch out. Now that's not necessarily a problem. Some people just have things that they're better at or more inclined towards. And as long as it doesn't result in creative stagnation or worse product, I don't really think mangaka should have to diversify their genres. But something I do find very interesting is when an author decides to switch genres out of their own creative liberty. Tsutomu Nihei is a prolific sci-fi mangaka, writing a number of incredible series such as Noise, Blam, and the not weird parts of Knights of Sidonia. Blam is still my personal favorite sci-fi manga of all time. Its gritty, biomechanical, surrealist world instills the perfect blend of fear and wonder. And while I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of Knights of Sidonia, I think its cultural influence is undeniable. And in terms of sci-fi ideas and the art of the manga, Nihei still holds himself to a very high standard. Nihei has a very distinct art style, and to me it's always been very closely linked to his signature sci-fi works, which is why I was incredibly shocked to come across a random fantasy manga called Tower Dungeon that immediately reminded me of his aesthetic. And sure enough, Tower Dungeon is the newest of Nihei's works, and completely deviates from his previous penchant for spaceships and biomechanical tech. As I said before, I think it is fascinating when an author decides to switch genres of their own devices. If you confine yourself to writing in one genre or style, it can be hard to consistently push boundaries with your work. But when switching from one genre to another, you can often come up with groundbreaking ideas and end up doing things that no one has ever seen. And I think that's exactly what happened with Tower Dungeon. Nihei clearly brought some of his previous sci-fi sensibilities into this high fantasy story, and it resulted in a really unique and fascinating read. While Tower Dungeon does share some of the less desirable aspects of Nihei's stories, it is nonetheless an incredible manga. So let's talk about what makes this manga so special. I think the best way to go about this would be to first discuss aspects of Tower Dungeon and consider how they've grown and evolved from Nihei's previous works. Then we can compare these elements to other high fantasy stories and see how Tower Dungeon breaks the mold. One of my favorite aspects of Tower Dungeon, and one of the things that instantly clued me into this being a Nihei story, were the absolutely insane monster designs. Nihei has always had a penchant for designing silhouettes that were over the top in all of the right ways. Whether it be the contorted and angular features of Blam's Silicon Life, or the shape-shifting biomechanical Ghana of Knights of Sidonia, to me, Nihei is the king of visually distinct and disturbing design. And this penchant of his comes through so clearly in Tower Dungeon, but with an appropriate fantastical twist. Tower Dungeon, despite all of its complexities and uniqueness, still uses some classic fantasy monsters, ones that are so common they may have you rolling your eyes. The central antagonist is a necromancer. The heroes and protectors of the kingdom are called Dracometamorphs because they're basically just dragons. And these two factions are accompanied by a whole slew of other familiar fantasy staples, like undead skeletons and chests with an appetite. But despite how basic that sounds, Nihei ensures that each and every entity in the story gets the design overhaul that they deserve. From the necromancers and dragons I mentioned before to even the simple but effective design of the Knights of the Tower, every single creature and entity in this world evokes so much emotion. Nothing looks the way you expect it to, and it's always for the best. Despite for the most part being good guys, the aforementioned Dracometamorphs are often fairly horrid to look upon. Their dragon faces are deformed and stretched versions of how they looked as humans, a far cry from the regal and angular look of most classic dragons. Well, except for the obvious counterexample of Countess Iowa, but she gets ejected from the story within a few pages of her introduction. Furthermore, the necromancers, which retain many of the same powers of a classic necromancer, are given a very interesting twist. Instead of being magicians or wizards that simply tap into dark magic to raise the dead, the necromancers of this world are their own species. They are compelled by their nature to birth small creatures known as necromites, which can infect corpses and raise them from the dead. Instead of having a hood and being wreathed in skulls, the main necromancer in Tower Dungeon is a tentacled monster who has taken over the body of the king. The necromancers in this story have an eldritch feel to them which I found really compelling, and it's one that helped differentiate Tower Dungeon from other fantasy tales. These somewhat off-putting design choices are clear holdovers from Nihei's previous style. Body horror and complex silhouettes have always been staple elements of his earlier sci-fi masterpieces. However, these ideas have been very cleanly tempered and distilled. In contrast to the sharp, jagged edges of Nihei's work in Blam, the contorted creatures of Tower Dungeon are often round and lumpy. They're clearly made of flesh and bone. They have musculature and consistent features, all things that are departures from the alien and biomechanical world of Blam. And the way Nihei's style of creature design comes through in Tower Dungeon does so much to push the story forward. I found myself getting so excited to see the next monster the story would conjure up. I'd comb through the pages to try and find a new and interesting interpretation of a fantasy creature I'd grown so bored of. With how oversaturated the fantasy genre has been nowadays, it's so hard to find anything close to groundbreaking out there. All you need to be popular is a scary demon lord, a dragon that can turn into a human, and an overpowered main character that can make sense of it all. And I'm sick of it. But while some of these classic, overdone fantasy tropes are present in Tower Dungeon, they're always depicted in a way that makes them impossible to ignore. The carefully constructed horror of this world, the way each and every adversary feels distinct and monstrous. Tower Dungeon blazes a trail past these other fantasy stories by proving that creativity and design is important. I can't imagine how much extra work it must have taken to try and reinvent these classic monsters in Nihei's own signature image. But that effort was clearly worth it to make a story that is this breathtaking in design and aesthetic. And furthermore, it's clear that on top of simply augmenting his style to fit the fantasy world of Tower Dungeon, Nihei has made significant improvements to his art style as a whole. Blam and Knights of Sidonia are both incredible works of art. Just looking at the backgrounds and the paneling, the sheer amount of attention to detail in each stroke is absurd. But within these artistically breathtaking series, in my opinion, the characters have always been one of the most questionable aspects. They don't look bad per se, but they're very distinct in their appearance. They often hover somewhere between being too realistic and too cartoonish, and the result is a little bit uncanny. It's not like this aspect drags the series down at all. For Blam at least, this aspect lends to the overall uncertainty of the world. But looking at Nihei's work in Tower Dungeon, it's clear how much his style has changed. Every single character in Tower Dungeon is drawn so cleanly. Their silhouettes are all distinct and consistent to their identity, which makes the relatively large cast of the manga work so well. It seems like Nihei has fused some of his earlier habits when drawing characters with a more standard anime look, and the result is something really incredible. The sheer amount of detail and creativity of Nihei's style makes up for the somewhat basic way that most manga use to draw their characters, while at the same time the characters all remain distinct and recognizable because of the consistency in how they are drawn. It's a small thing, but I would often find myself getting lost in the wide vistas of Blam because of how indistinct the characters can be. You have this sense reading the story that despite how important Killy's quest is to the world at large, he's a speck of dust within the sprawling skeleton of the city. The narrative is ultimately about him and his journey, but it's equally a story that allows us to explore as many aspects of the city as we can. And that split focus is often reflected in how the characters are drawn, with less pull and focus than the world around them. In contrast to that, Yuva and the main party in Tower Dungeon are our anchors. Their journey is the focus and what the story structures itself around, which is a neat little bit of art and story synergy. There's one last thing that I want to talk about in regards to the difference between Tower Dungeon and other fantasy stories, and that's Nihei's classic love for megastructures. Whether it be any of the massive constructs within Blam or the titular siege ship Sidonia from Knights of Sidonia, Nihei has a well-documented affection for constructing massive, incomprehensible worlds for the protagonist to scurry around. And Tower Dungeon is no different, with the Dragon's Tower being immediately introduced as the primary setting within the first chapter of the manga. While Tower Dungeon is still very concerned with its world and the way that it works, the world building we do get is always very grounded in the main cast. The way we slowly learn about the king and the different species of the story makes that clear. We only ever hear this stuff discussed in anecdotes and in relation to characters that are currently central to the story. It's a small change, but one that I found very appropriate for this type of narrative. Yuva and his main party are the driving force in the story, and letting them flourish in the spotlight fills the world with so much character and personality. But this isn't actually the aspect of Tower Dungeon that I find groundbreaking. Despite everything I just said, I'm in love with the choice to make the Dragon's Tower as central as it is, and I really believe that it's a decision more fantasy stories should learn from. Fantasy as a whole is based on absurd notions. The idea that dragons and magic can exist is inherently fantastical, that's why it's called fantasy. But I feel as though in recent years, fantasy has become a bit too basic. The predefined tropes and habits of the genre have become more important than the central idea of fantasy in the first place. The idea that you can make a world where anything can happen. It's really sad to me how the genre that's defined by its creativity and freedom has become marred with so many lifeless stories. High fantasy worlds that are copy-pastes of each other and refuse to break free of the mold. That's why I believe Tower Dungeon is so special, because it dares to truly be different by bringing Nihei's style to a world of swords and sorcery. The Dragon Tower specifically is such an incredible example of this, because it shows how little the rules truly matter when creating a fantasy story like this one. The Dragon's Tower is a completely nonsensical entity. It levitates in the sky and stretches upward for so long that it can be seen for miles. It can descend from the heavens with the power of royal blood, but aside from that and its past, it has pretty much no other explanation. And I love that. We don't need a complex explanation that makes sense of the tower, in the same way that it doesn't really matter why the city functions and blam. The tower is an incredibly creative and well-constructed location that lends so much flavor and character to the story just by existing. And it doesn't matter if it makes no sense. This is a lesson that I feel more fantasy authors need to learn. The reason so many of these classic fantasy tropes are so common is because they're familiar. You don't need to explain the rules of dragons or zombies because they've been defined so many times for you. But that's because they've been done to death. And to use them in their most basic and predefined form is to go against the very essence of fantasy as a genre. All of my favorite fantasy series are ones that break the mold and define something new, even at the risk of it being nonsensical. Despite all of its problems, Made in Abyss will always have my favorite fantasy world of all time, because of how the story chooses to define it from the ground up. And a recent fantasy manga called Killing Me, Killing You caught my eye because of its absurd and whimsical world. All of these series define the essence of what fantasy is, in my opinion, and Tower Dungeon adds to that list of true fantasy stories with its incredibly innovative ideas and commitment to the true chaos of magic. I'm really glad to see the widespread acclaim of Tower Dungeon. It really embodies the spirit of what fantasy can and should be, in my opinion, and to see it accepted with such open arms gives me a lot of hope. I think it's really interesting how Nihei's style of sci-fi got translated to this high fantasy story, the echoes of which become some of the most interesting aspects of this manga, and I hope I was able to convey that. If you're interested, I definitely recommend checking out Tower Dungeon. It has unfortunately maintained some of my least favorite aspects of Knights of Sidonia, like the harem throughline and the main character being clueless, but I think outside of those things, this manga really is exceptional. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Manga videos like this take a lot of time and effort, so I'd really appreciate your support on this project. Thank you for watching.